I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine the latest. Today, as Donald Trump's special envoy meets Putin for so-called ceasefire negotiations, President Zelensky releases a video marking a year since Ukrainian troops invaded Russia's Kursk oblast, and Ukraine's Prosecutor General's office opens yet another investigation into alleged Russian war crimes after a video emerges of a civilian being gunned down in the Donbas.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 6th of August, 3 years and 165 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our executive editor for audio, Francis Dearnley, and Maeve Cullinan from the Telegraph's Global Health Security team. I started with the latest military updates. Donald Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, he's been meeting Putin in Moscow today. We're told the meeting lasted 3 hours and he left just a few minutes ago. I was watching on social media. The images came up a couple of minutes ago. I think from pretty recently before that, but I don't know exactly when he left. But I think it's just finished, that meeting. You'll remember Friday, of course, is the latest of Donald Trump's zombie lines for a ceasefire. Zombie line is my new word. It's like a deadline, except the issue in question just keeps coming back from the grave. Anyway, more on that shortly from Francis. So let's start in Ukraine. And Ukraine's Prosecutor General's office has opened a war crimes investigation after newly released video footage on an unnamed Telegram channel reportedly shows a Russian soldier murdering a civilian in Donetsk Oblast. This is Kyiv Independent reporting. They say the incident happened as a civilian was attempting to evacuate from the village of Udashny. That's about 10 k's west-southwest-ish of Pokrovsk in the Donbas. The video shows a civilian walking along the road, suitcase in hand, presumably with personal belongings, when he was gunned down. A statement from the Prosecutor General's office says a Russian armed forces serviceman cynically opened fire from an ambush set up in a ruined building and killed the passerby with an automatic weapon. Authorities say the killing has been officially entered into the Unified Register of Pre-Trial Investigations, marking the third recorded case this year of Russian forces allegedly killing civilians in Donetsk Oblast alone. At this juncture, I would point you to an article online at The Economist, an article called Why the Laws of War Are Widely Ignored. It's a good roundup of what we mean by international humanitarian law and quite why it's so difficult to prosecute either individuals or get sufficient clarity between states that are in open conflict. Anyway, do have a look at that. We'll put the link in the episode notes. Now, elsewhere inside the country, Russian attacks across Ukraine yesterday killed at least 7, injured at least 37. 45 drones were fired yesterday at Ukraine. 9 got through. 2 people were killed in Zaporizhia Oblast, 12 injured, including at least 4 children. This comes from Zaporizhia Oblast Governor Ivan Fedorov. There are reports that a recreation centre in Zaporizhia was hit, which accounted for many of the casualties there. Now, it's a year since the Kursk incursion, since Ukrainian forces pushed into Russia in the Kursk Oblast. President Zelensky has released a video this morning marking the occasion, clearly also messaging Donald Trump ahead of these talks in Moscow. Anyway, on the video, the sort of text overlaying the video included words saying Ukraine surprised the world at a time when no one expected it, when everyone was speaking of a stalemate in the war, when the world began to doubt Ukraine. Ukrainian warriors entered Russia and brought the war back to where it had come from. They say they inflicted 77,000 casualties on Russia and took 1,000 prisoners. The text carries on and says, Russia must end the war it itself started. Ukraine will undoubtedly defend its independence. As I say, I think this is clearly signalling that even as Russia continues to make advances, as we've been reporting, with the assessment that for many thinking that Putin feels he has the initiative on the battlefield at the moment, so sees no reason to make any accommodation for Donald Trump. So even as that's going on, Ukraine is saying, do not bet against us. It was quite extraordinary incursion. Now, sticking in that area, going a little bit to the west into Belarus, Russian troops and military equipment have started arriving today in Belarus for the upcoming Zapad 2025 joint military exercises that are going to kick off in September. Now, while the Belarusian Defence Ministry said that it was going to include over 13,000 participants, NATO sources suggested the drills might involve as many as 150,000. There is concern that they could be used for some kind of cover against continued aggression against Ukraine, or maybe renewed aggression, a new front. They try to push in from Belarus at the start of the full-scale invasion. There's concern that this might be a prelude to that again. You'll remember Zapad 21 obviously took place in September 2021. A lot of the equipment was left in place after that, some units as well, we think, and many people saw that as a prelude to the February 2022 invasion. And hence that's the context in which this Zapad 25 is being viewed, and this talk, you'll hear from Francis in a moment, about a possible suggestion from Putin of a drone and missile truce. So, if there was some kind of truce in the air, we know Ukraine is striking a lot of Russian infrastructure at the moment, so that may be one reason why he's trying to push for something in the air. It would come as no surprise if he did that and then try to push in on the ground from Belarus, for example. But that's a bit of speculation. Right, a couple more for me. There's an interesting story from the Institute for the Study of War today, the US-based think tank. They say a Ukrainian company has recently launched a new reusable interceptor drone designed to bring down Shahed and other types of Russian drones. So the company called Technory say they've developed a reusable interceptor drone called the Mongoose, designed to intercept Russian drones. This interceptor is said to have a jet engine and an automatic homing system, which allows it to approach an enemy drone, then fire a projectile into its engine or propeller, and then carry on its mission and return home. Chief exec of the company, a chap called Hennady Zuldin, speaking to Ukrainian defense technology outlet Defender Media, said the drone can fly about 300 kilometers an hour, lock onto a target from 800 meters away, and then has an auto guidance system which activates when the target is within a range of about 200 meters. Maximum flight altitude of 5,000 meters, 15,000 feet in old money, and a combat radius of 12 kilometers. So interesting stuff. Those figures all released for public consumption, so they're either massively underplayed or total rubbish. But anyway, an interesting idea, that sort of reusable interceptor drones. Now, talking about equipment, you'll remember Dutch Defence Minister Ruben Brekelmans speaking a couple of days ago, announcing the Netherlands is allocating 500 million euros to purchase American weapon systems, including Patriot components and missiles. We reported that at the time. I missed this, so apologies for that, but I didn't realise that was from a new fund called the Pearl, the Prioritised Ukrainian Requirements List. So I'd not heard of this initiative. I knew the mechanics of it, but I didn't know it was called the Pearl. Anyway, so we're going to talk about that a lot more. So this is that fund that we've talked of that allows NATO members and anyone else basically who wants to join in to put money into a pool to buy American weapons for Ukraine. As I said, we knew of the scheme. We've talked of the scheme. Didn't know it was actually called the Pearl. Apologies if I'm behind the power curve on that one. So connected to that, NATO said yesterday that Denmark, Norway and Sweden are going to pitch in another $500 million of military aid to buy more air defence systems, Patriots, as well as anti-tank systems and ammunition for Ukraine. Connected to that, Ukraine's Denis Shmyhal, speaking earlier today, said the US has approved another foreign military sales contract for Ukraine worth over $200 million for artillery support, other sort of ground transportation and logistics. He put out a note on X saying the first package includes equipment, repairs and technical support for M777 howitzers, the big sort of ground-based or fixed 155mm artillery pieces. That's valued at $104 million. He said the second package of just under $100 million is for logistics and therefore really boring. So we won't spend any more time discussing that. Joking. Don't at me, the blanket stackers. Now, that's it for the military updates. Francis, a lot going on today. What's been happening in Moscow? Any sign of this air and missile truce?
Well, thanks, Dom. Not yet. I do feel a bit like Bill Murray in Groundhog Day with all these talks of airstrike truces. It's where we were really all those months ago when Trump was on those regular calls with Putin. So I think we have to ask ourselves what has changed. Of course, the optimists would say Trump has seen the light with regard to the true nature of Putin's war and his ambitions, and therefore the threats of 100% tariffs are sincere and very serious. But does Moscow believe that? And just how watertight is the White House's commitment to seeing through these threats? Those are the questions we need to bear in mind as Steve Witkoff, as predicted, arrived to meet Putin today. The footage, as you say, Dom, that we've seen so far has them rather chummy, smiling at each other, shaking hands, not as enthusiastic as some of their previous encounters. I seem to recall Witkoff full-on embraced Putin once, but it wasn't exactly loaded with menace, let's put it that way. The latest this morning, though, is that, surprise, surprise, Putin could pause Russia's missile and drone attacks, as you say, on Ukraine to try and convince Trump to back down from his threat to impose sanctions. That is what we thought was most likely, that some kind of offer, some kind of overture would be made, which would be enough to stall this happening. That is, of course, the Moscow playbook through and through. As Joe Barnes writes for us, it is thought that this offer could appease the US and see Moscow avoid the sanctions threatened by Washington. Trump said he would make a determination on tariffs and its international oil trading partners after the discussions expected later today. Now, what we don't know is whether the meeting that took place that we've seen Witkoff leaving, is that phase one of a meeting and there's going to be another this evening, or was that it? Again, we don't know and probably won't know for several hours. Now, Dmitry Peskov, Kremlin spokesman, said, "We consider such meetings to be very important, but we don't comment on them in advance," which is a bit rich considering he usually comments on everything and anything, Mr. Peskov, when it suits him. But anyway, when asked about slapping a 100% tariff on Russian energy buyers, Trump told reporters late last night, "I never said a percentage, but we'll be doing quite a bit of that. We'll see what happens over the next fairly short period of time." So hardly the unequivocal commitment many would have hoped to hear. And more on the exact nature of the tariffs in a moment. But as for this idea around the air truce, we understand that it was floated during talks between Putin and Lukashenko last Friday, as you say. Lukashenko said in a conversation with reporters, "I say, yes, Russia is interested in this idea. President Putin, but you don't want it." He was speaking to Western journalists. "Tell Zelensky to go along with it," he said in a conversation with Keith Kellogg. Now, we do expect Kellogg to travel to Kyiv for talks with Zelensky following the American discussions with Putin today. After our broadcast yesterday, Zelensky said that he had a productive phone call with Trump, adding that the pair discussed the deal for European nations to buy American weapons on behalf of Ukraine after the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden and Norway, I think, contributed that $1 billion to buy air defence systems and other ammunition for Kyiv. A really significant step forward, as we've discussed recently.
Yeah, those of us in the know call that the Pearl.
That's the pearl, rightio. So their economy continues to decline, Zelensky said, and that's exactly why Moscow is so sensitive to this prospect and President Trump's resolve. This can change a lot. Now, just as a little side tangent, I thought this post by Maria Snegovaya, Senior Fellow at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, was quite interesting. She said, "Here are the impressions of a friend who just returned from St. Petersburg. Recruitment ads for the war are everywhere." Bear in mind just there, recruitment, not conscription. Recruitment ads are everywhere. "The quality of food has sharply declined. Prices are rising. Western websites are completely inaccessible, even those not officially blocked. And internet outages are frequent. Sometimes nothing loads at all. There are periodic alerts about drone attacks. Overall, the atmosphere is one of anxiety and instability." Now, if that is true, then we should take seriously those who argue that Russia is genuinely nervous about these talks if they go awry. But I confess to being sceptical, not least because of a piece in Reuters which argues convincingly, speaking to Kremlin sources, that Putin is unlikely to bow to a sanctions ultimatum because he still retains the goal of capturing the 4 regions of Ukraine we've spoken about so many times. So the first source said Putin was privately concerned about the recent deterioration of US ties and still retains the hope that he can again befriend Trump and trade with the West, and is worried about Trump's irritation. But with Moscow's forces advancing on the battlefield and Ukraine under heavy military pressure, Putin does not believe now is the time to end the war, adding that neither the Russian people nor the army would understand if he stops now. Then a second source said Putin cannot afford to end the war just because Trump wants it. And a third person familiar with Kremlin thinking told Reuters Russia wanted to take all 4 regions and didn't see the logic in stopping at a time of battlefield gains during Russia's summer offensive, albeit modest ones. Now, that first Russian source also noted that Putin, in pursuing the conflict, was turning his back on a US offer made in March that Washington, in return for his agreement to a full ceasefire, would remove the US sanctions, recognise Russian possession of Crimea, annexed back in 2014, of course, and acknowledge de facto Russian control of the territory captured by its forces since 2022. Now, the source called that offer a fantastic chance. Yeah, I mean, that's putting it mildly, but said stopping a war was much more difficult than starting it. So there you have it. If you agree with that analysis, then the Russian war machine is not able to simply stop now, and the incentive within the Kremlin is not there. So we return to the argument that Putin will only stop when he is forced to, and any pledges of ceasefires in the air or elsewhere are more likely than not simply designed to equivocate and delay. Now, another factor here is just how crippling or not a carried-out threat by Trump would be. Adrian Blomfield has just written a very interesting piece for The Telegraph looking in detail at the proposals. He quotes Associate Fellow at Chatham House, Timothy Ash, as saying that 100% tariffs on any country buying Russian oil would be significant. Quote, Russia's exports would slow to a trickle. Its fiscal revenues would stop almost completely. We would see major runs on banks and the currency would come under severe pressure. But critically, the piece goes on to underscore that it would also unleash turmoil on world markets, send oil prices skyrocketing, and chill the global economy. Now, given that, we here have to ask, is it really in Trump's nature to do that when the incentive is not as strong politically as it was to carry out Liberation Day, when the calculations were perceived as worth it for the leverage it would give the US over other countries? But this would be causing considerable damage for a motivation, ending a war, which doesn't really seem to be one which Trump is as ideologically invested in. So as such, investors initially dismissed it all as bluster because of that and the warm relations that Trump has with Putin. There's also been another shift signposted yesterday, that of suggesting a more modest sanctions package targeting certain states more specifically. Not China, Russia's biggest energy customer, of course, or Turkey, the third largest. Instead, he singled out India, the second largest buyer. Now, last week, Trump raised tariffs on Indian goods to 25%, above the rate applied to Asian competitors, and promised an additional penalty for Delhi's oil purchases from Russia. He told CNBC last night they're fueling the war machine, and if they're going to do that, then I'm not happy. Now, as Adrian writes, Trump's circumspection, as far as Beijing is concerned, probably reflects geopolitical calculation. Washington and Beijing only recently stabilised relations, and Trump is hoping to stage a summit with Xi before the end of the year. That he feels freer to confront India suggests ulterior motives. Despite the president's warm personal ties with Modi, India's prime minister, US relations with the country he leads have soured. Trade negotiations have stalled, frustrating Trump. He was also reportedly incensed when Pakistan, not India, praised his mediation and even nominated him for a Nobel Peace Prize after the India-Pakistan clashes in May. Modi, by contrast, played down Trump's role and has paid the price for his perceived ingratitude. In June, Trump invited Pakistan's powerful army chief to lunch at the White House, pledged to improve relations with India's chief enemy, and announced plans to help develop its oil reserves. Now, if what Adrian says is true, then beyond the bluster, the truth would be this. Trump does want to see an end to the war, but he's not really serious about strong universal tariffs. Rather, he would hit at India, not because he primarily holds them responsible for keeping Russia's war economy going, but because he has other goals in mind. Now, of course, you might think, why does the motive matter if the outcome ends up being the same? Because if the outcome Trump wants, particularly relating to ties between the US and India, comes to pass eventually, then he might be likely to cease the tariffs regardless of what is happening in Ukraine and to Russia's economy. So whilst you have the Chinese Foreign Ministry saying today, now is the key moment for the settlement, Russia and Ukraine have taken an important step forward by starting negotiations, the process is at a crucial stage, we're hearing all of this kind of rhetoric, but the critical question remains, just how many people really believe that in the capitals that matter at the present moment? I have to confess, Dom, I'm not overtly optimistic, but I, of course, would love to be proven wrong.
Well, and I would love to prove you wrong, Francis, so I'll see what I can do. Now, I'm delighted to welcome to the pod for the first time Maeve Cullinan, Global Health Security reporter. Maeve, you've been looking at an issue that we've caught wind of occasionally over the last 3.5 years, and it really riles me because it is such a simple thing to fix or not to have a problem with in the first place. Prevention better than the cure. But anyway, enough of me rambling on. You've been speaking to some people. You've written a piece saying that the cult of tourniquets is causing thousands of unnecessary amputations in Ukraine. What have you been looking at? Who are you talking to? And what is going on here? Why is it happening? Welcome to the pod.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. Yeah, as you say, it's a really interesting topic because it seems like there would be such an easy fix. So essentially what's been happening is a tourniquet, which is obviously a tight band that is placed above a wound after someone's been injured. And what it does is they essentially stops catastrophic bleeding. So they're a life-saving device used in war zones all around the world. And they became really popular in Western armies during the walks in Iraq and Afghanistan. They were used by all NATO forces, and they stop bleeding, and they're fantastic things if they're used for under 2 hours. So what they do is they stop the blood supply going to the limb, the leg or the arm that's been injured. And if you can be evacuated to hospital within under 2 hours, you take the tourniquet off, no damage is done, you can then treat the wound. You either might have to have an amputation or you don't, and then your wound is treated. But if they're left on for more than 2 hours and it completely cuts off the blood supply, what happens is that causes tissue death and your limb then has to be amputated. So in Iraq and Afghanistan, Western forces pretty much had control of the airspace. So, you could get a military helicopter and get a soldier evacuated within an hour or so. Often actually it was a lot shorter than that. It's about half an hour. You could get to a military hospital, Camp Bastion and that sort of thing. But in Ukraine, because of the drones, people are very rarely evacuated via helicopter. It's often via car or train. So that can take hours and even days. So these tourniquets are basically being applied in the field from panicked, largely untrained soldiers who might have had 5 or so days of basic training. They see a wound, they panic, they place a tourniquet on, and then someone is evacuated to hospital. Might take 10 or 12 hours, at which time their limb has to be amputated because the tissue has died. And so I've been speaking to doctors in Ukraine, and their estimates are extraordinary. So one doctor I spoke to, Captain Rom Stevens, who is now retired, but he was a senior US military medical officer in Iraq, Afghanistan and East Africa, says that of the 100,000 amputations that have taken place in Ukraine since 2022, up to 75% could have been avoided if evacuation times were quicker. And also, again, as you said, this cult of tourniquet use, if they weren't so heavily relied on, the bleeding could have stopped through a pressure bandage or through another method, so they didn't actually need them in the first place. So yeah, that's basically what the issue is. And the reason why it's happening, again, experts say, is because of these sort of imported Western military medical protocols, chiefly the Tactical Combat Casualty Care Handbook, which is a set of guidelines developed by the US Department of Defense in the 1990s. And this guy, Captain Stevens, actually was an author of that handbook, and again emphasised aggressive tourniquet use, but it was meant to only be for highly trained medics and for situations where there was rapid air evacuation. So yeah, there's sort of a mismatch there, and these doctors are saying the guidelines really need to be changed. And yeah, that's essentially the core issue.
Thanks, Maeve. Now, what surprised me when I read your piece was that to go along with the training of how to use a tourniquet, I was amazed that this risk of leaving it on for too long and therefore killing the limb or even producing toxic shock if you leave it on too long, so that whilst the limb might survive, the individual might die then from having all the toxins through their system. I'm surprised that wasn't reinforced, because when I've ever been trained on tourniquets, even not just when I was in the army, but even when we here as journalists, when we did our hostile environment training, it was absolutely emphasised that you can't put these things on and just leave them. You know, the timings differ depending on the medical advice at the time, but I think it was something like put it on hard. I mean, really hard. It was bloody painful. And after 15 minutes, gently relax to see if the blood then flows. Don't suddenly let it off, because that sudden surge of blood could burst whatever clot was there. But gently relax the tourniquet to see if the blood still flows. And if it does, then tighten it up. But I'm surprised that that part of the training, which was so fundamental, wasn't also part of this. So do you think the guidance is just not being followed, or is there just a fundamental breakdown in the training procedures?
Yeah, so I think it's a mix of things. So last year, NATO sent a team of military and medical experts to Ukraine to look into this issue, and what they said was an unacceptable high complication rate from the use of tourniquets, resulting in amputation, renal failure and death. And so what happened in response to that, they haven't published any formal updates to their guidelines, but there was an understanding that something had to change. And so this set of guidelines were slightly updated within Ukraine, again, not quite formally, but disseminated through training camps and that sort of thing. And they said we need to really focus on this issue of tourniquet conversion, which is what you mentioned there, which is when you gently release the band every 20 minutes or so to a point where you can then transition it to a pressure bandage, and then that should stop the tissue completely dying and also reduce the risk of toxins flooding back into the bloodstream and overwhelming the kidneys, which can lead to renal failure and death. And so that understanding, again, last year, I think it was January 2024, when they updated, or again, there was more of a consciousness around this issue. But what I'm being told is that because the army is largely made up of volunteers, conscripts, often with minimal training, there is just so much panic on the battlefield, right? And tourniquets, again, are undoubtedly, they've saved thousands of lives. And there is this thing of let's save life over limb. So if you're under fire, you're under a lot of stress, people are just too panicked, is what I'm being told, to go through that meticulous process of taking down the band. But it's a difficult one. If you just Google Tourniquets Ukraine, you'll see charities, British charities, donating thousands of the devices, people driving them to the border. There's such a reliance on them. So yeah, it's very difficult. And again, if I've never been on a battlefield, I don't know how I'd react in that situation, but a lot of it comes down to that sort of panic.
Thank you. Thanks, Maeve. Well, I should reiterate, folks, that we are not qualified medical personnel. I'm very much out of date. It's been a while since we did our training here as well. So please don't take our advice and timings as gospel. But if you are in this situation and you are using a tourniquet, or even anywhere in civilian circumstances, I know many people who've had to use them in road traffic accidents and what have you. But if you're in this position in Ukraine, do seek your medical professionals' advice as to how long you should leave them on for, what the current advice is, all that kind of jazz. But yeah, it's a fairly blunt tool, the tourniquet, which is why it's so simple. It's been around for hundreds of years. But used incorrectly, it can have catastrophic consequences. And let us know what your experience has been of them. Do take it easy out there, guys. Right, thank you. I'm going to start moving towards final thoughts now. I will kick off. I'll just point you to some words today from Belarusian opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, a very impressive politician. She's calling for us all to join the solidarity rallies for Belarus. So she says on August the 9th, 2020, Belarusians rose up to defend their freedom. 5 years later, we still stand united. This week, join marches, vigils and cultural events around the world. So she's put out a link. I saw this on X. I've had a look at it. She's put out a link to a list of events marking the 5 years of protest. We'll put the link in the episode notes, but there's events all over the world, basically, and across the North America, Seattle, New York, Toronto, even good old Charlotte in North Carolina. Shout out to the Providence Day Chargers. London and across across Europe. So do go and have a look at that. And if you're not elsewhere on Saturday, maybe go and have a look and chat to the Belarusian protesters, hear what it was all about. In a nutshell, Ms. Tsikhanouskaya was seen as the legitimate winner of the 2020 presidential election against Alexander Lukashenko. Since then, because she was not allowed to take power, since then she's led the opposition to his authoritarian rule through an alternative government operating out of Lithuania and Poland. Lithuania has recognised Ms. Tsikhanouskaya as the legitimate head of state of Belarus. So this is not... I don't mean to delegitimise any opposition movements, but Lithuania has recognised her as the head of state. So do have a look at the link, and if you're around on Saturday, go and have a chat to these people and update ourselves on the situation in Belarus. Okay, Francis, where do you want to leave our listeners?
Well, 80 years ago today, nuclear weapons were used for the first time in history, of course, on Hiroshima. 3 days later, the US then dropped a second bomb on Nagasaki. I was reading about this quite recently, non-related to the anniversary, and as we've spoken about on the podcast before, one of the most important elements that's often not talked about as to why Japan surrendered was the fact that the Russians were turning their attentions to the Eastern Theatre, to the Pacific. I think they just invaded Manchuria around the same time, and there were huge fears that Japan would be occupied by the Soviets at the same time as the dropping of the atomic bomb. And also, again, hindsight's something that we have to sometimes shake with history. They had no idea that the US only had 2 atomic bombs. So they thought that it was quite conceivable that this would just keep going until the surrender. So anyway, just a few broader reflections on that subject. But of course, the real significance of this, we've spoken about it so many times, is the brave new world it created and the Cold War that followed. And I think it does bear repeating in the present context, the way nuclear weapons have been treated in this war and how it's made the world less safe. Putin's saber-rattling, threatening nukes, made America and Europe flinch in its support of Ukraine earlier on in the war and in other critical phases. And that's now a matter of record. We've had people on this podcast who were in the room who have confirmed that unequivocally. And there are numerous sources now that make that very clear beyond the speculations that we made at the time. And the fact, of course, fundamentally, that Ukraine did not have these weapons or fall under a protective umbrella left it dangerously exposed, signalling critically to other states that the acquiring of these weapons was essential for their own security. And I think, again, it bears repeating today on this significant anniversary, 80 years, that we ask ourselves, are we, through the approach that has been adopted as a people and as a world, been one on these weapons that has made the world more or less safe in the last 3 or 4 years? I would argue it has made us less safe, but it has been done under the auspices of trying to make us more safe. And that, I think, actually makes us even more vulnerable in the world that may well be not too far around the corner if things go really, really wrong. So a rather sombre way to end, Dom, but I think it's worth it on a significant anniversary such as this, to be honest.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. I watched Oppenheimer last week, actually.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, interesting. I was surprised. I didn't know the history of him. I was surprised, dare I say it, at his slight naivety. You know, he was hoping that he would be able to control the proliferation of atomic technology, nuclear arms, etc., after the war. I was quite surprised. Now, it's very laudable to put the efforts into trying to do that, but I was surprised, if the film is accurate in this portrayal, at how much he believed it was actually possible, because I once it's out there, it's out there.
They certainly believe, the scientists as a community, that there was an opportunity for them to control the way these weapons were developed internationally. But of course, the major fear posed and threat posed by the Soviets immediately meant that the powers that be turned their attention there and knew that it really wasn't going to be possible. I think logically, to be honest with you, Dom, I don't think it was possible to control. Once technology is developed, it's not possible to control it because it always becomes the incentive of other powers to. So I think probably, even though it's laudable Oppenheimer and the others' attempts to control it, and of course it's portrayed very sympathetically in the film. I don't think it was ever possible. I think in that sense Truman and the others who were calculating on that basis were correct. I do think, though, that the film is very unfair on Truman. It has that very rather unpleasant scene at the end where he basically says it was your cross to bear, as it were. You didn't drop the bomb, I dropped the bomb. And while it is true that Truman did, I believe, make a comment to an aide that, you know, he was quite surprised by Oppenheimer's emotional reaction to this and saying that really it's not his responsibility. He's developed this, but it's not his thing. The responsibility comes to me. I don't think Truman was doing it in an arrogant or an angry way, as is portrayed in the film. I think it was more of a kind of an acceptance of the reality of the responsibility of the president and the decision to make the drops that he did. But of course, you know, the jury is out. But I think, and one last thought on this, Don, but it's just occurred to me that when we're reflecting on this war, people quite often ask me, what are the turning points? What are the most significant moments? And I think it's a really great question. And I think actually a lot of the critical and most important decisions that were made were probably before the war, in those last few weeks, and indeed in the first maybe month or so. I think the same can be said of atomic weapons as well, in that period, in the Oppenheimer period, because the decisions that were made when the weapons were dropped and immediately afterwards, both in Moscow, in Washington and elsewhere, shaped the entire architecture that followed and that we still inhabit today. And so it's very, very hard to extricate oneself when certain key decisions are made when they are. But sorry, a few random thoughts.
Well, no, interesting. And just without labouring the counterfactual too far, I wonder when did the McCarthy era really start kicking in? Because a lot was made in the film of Oppenheimer's earlier flirtations with communism and hard left politics, and that was held up to be one of his reasons for being equivocal on the use of nuclear weapons, and therefore a reason to discount his concerns. And I just wonder, and I don't know US history that well in this area. I wonder how quickly the McCarthy era came in, such that they were able to make the case that Oppenheimer, your views don't count on this because you're a commie and all the rest of it. But that may be a counterfactual too far.
It was pretty sharp, I think. I think that peak McCarthy is sort of it's the 1950s. So we're not talking long after the end of the Second World War. And certainly Oppenheimer was caught up in that sort of spirit. But bear in mind, there had been leaks of very valuable intelligence within Los Alamos, which is where the weapons were developed, and indeed that is what enabled the Soviets to develop the weapons quite quickly after the Americans had. So there were legitimate security concerns, but don't worry, I'm not defending McCarthyism, which of course went to the absolute extreme, and Oppenheimer should never have been persecuted in the way that he was, because of course the decisions that he had made were not ideological in the sense that he was sympathetic to the Soviets and believed that he was trying to stop the proliferation and was encouraging them to have it so that there would be this equality of powers. None of that. I think it was because he was a nuisance to the authorities at the time. He was considered a danger because he'd developed the weapon. If he was trying to denounce America having them whilst Moscow was developing them and expanding their arsenal, then that was, of course, a threat to, or a perceived threat to American security. But it's not a pleasant period. And of course there were similar instances in the UK and in Europe as well of individuals who were instrumental in the Second World War, but for political, ideological, cultural reasons after the fact, they were discarded. And of course the most notable example in Britain was Alan Turing for his homosexuality, although there were also perceived, I believe, to be some political charges against him as well, but I'm not an expert on Turing.
Thanks, Francis. Maeve, delighted to have you on the pod for the first time as not a guest, your colleague, but would you like the very last word today?
Thank you. So I just wanted to stress the point that was made to me, which is tourniquets are undoubtedly life-saving devices, but they come with quite considerable dangers. So there's this quote from Dr. Ostap Zukbak, who is a orthopedic trauma surgeon in Ukraine, and he's personally operated on hundreds of soldiers. And what he said is, as a doctor, I believe in the right hands, tourniquets are a brilliant thing, but in the wrong ones, they can be very dangerous. And adding to that, Captain Stevens, who is the US former senior medical officer in East Africa, he said there's been a generation of Ukrainian men traumatized by unnecessary amputations. And both of their points is not to get rid of the tourniquets completely, but just to use them as a last resort and in a lot more of a considerate way.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Francis and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons, to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells and David Nicholls.
My name is David Nicholls. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.